And now, a passage from History of the City of Cleveland, Its Settlement, Rise, and Progress by W. Scott Robison. While the war was progressing in the southern states, Cleveland, far removed from the scene of strife, seemed but slightly affected by the alternate flurry and stagnation of many other cities. Her population from 43,000 in 1860 had reached about 65,000 in 1865, an increase of 50%, representing a growth in proportion to numbers more rapid than that of any other northern city for that period. Her commercial and manufacturing interests were greatly stimulated by the war, and many new enterprises were inaugurated. The discoveries in the oil regions and the demand for the newly developed Lake Superior iron ore gave to the industries connected with those products an extraordinary impulse, soon placing Cleveland in the front rank of manufacturing cities. But the evil results of war were by no means unfelt. The unprecedented high prices of living, the scarcity of labor, the occasional alarms of raids from over the border, the increased municipal expenses by reason of heavy appropriations for bounties and reliefs, the augmented force of police, combined with the continual fever and unrest that awaited every item of news from the front, all united to draw away strength from business and labor. Especially was the closing period of the war marked by events the most stirring in the history of the city. The long suspense of 4 years was finally relieved on the 3rd of April, 1865, by the news of the fall of Richmond, and 7 days later by that of Lee's surrender. The report of the latter long-hoped-for event reached the city at 7 o'clock on the morning of April 10th, and soon the booming of the Secesh cannon on the public square brought out the whole populace, and their united voices burst into one frenzied huzzah that lasted throughout the entire day and far into the night. Business became suddenly suspended, and the faces of men, women, and children spoke out a joy that their throats and lungs were incessantly strained to utter. Country people poured into the streets by the thousands, and all classes were fused in the universal shouting, leaping, and embracing. It was the happiest day Cleveland ever saw. Though the air was foggy and gloomy, yet in a moment the city sprung, as if under a magician's spell, into the most gorgeous panorama of red, white, and blue, streaming from staffs, church steeples, hotels, and private houses, floating in huge flags from innumerable cords stretched across the streets, and folded in unlimited bunting about houses and doorposts. Water Street was one solid mass of Union colors. Even the horses were glorious with banners, and unlucky dogs hustled down the streets adorned with streamers and flags. The prominent citizens fell into line with fifes, tin horns, and drums, and all the boys in Cleveland followed at their heels, while brass bands resounded, cannon boomed, and the city shook with the demonstrations of her overjoyed multitudes. No such scene was ever before or since witnessed. But how inscrutable are the changes of Providence! 5 days later, the exultant city was plunged from these heights of ecstasy into the deepest sorrow. Between 2 Sundays came the news of Lee's surrender and Lincoln's assassination, and the patriotic emblems that on Monday glorified the city were on Saturday hidden by the mass of black and somber draping. Flags wrapped in black hung at half-mast. Festoons of black covered business and private houses. Perry's monument was buried in black, and streets that before were radiant with the glory of bright colors were now gloomy as death. People were no longer assembled in huge crowds, but gathered in sorrowful knots, with weeping eyes or hearts bursting with rage. They wandered about dejected and sad, not knowing what to do, speaking in whispers or with voices hushed by grief. The very air seemed thick and suffocating. The mayor issued a call for a meeting in the public square, where short speeches were made by Governors Todd and Brow. On the next day, funeral sermons were delivered in all the churches, and on Wednesday funeral services were conducted. On Friday, the 28th, just 2 weeks after the assassination, the body of the martyred president was brought to Cleveland on the way from Washington to its resting place in Springfield, Illinois. Just 4 years and 2 months after his first appearance in Cleveland, when on his triumphal trip to Washington to receive the oath of office, with the eyes of the nation turned hopefully towards him, he returned to the same people his great work accomplished, but himself the chief martyr to its fulfillment. Of the multitude of Cleveland citizens who cheered him on his first arrival, many had also been sacrificed to the same cause. Others were yet absent in the closing scenes of war, and upon the thousands who now beheld his returning corpse, the sufferings and anxiety and final glory of the last 4 years crowded with irresistible grief. The symbols of sorrow that had prevailed for the last 2 weeks were now increased tenfold. Every available spot wore a badge of mourning. The funeral train, preceded by a pilot engine, halted at the Euclid Avenue depot, and the coffin with its burden was received by an immense procession of military and civic associations, citizens, and visitors, numbering over 50,000. The procession, with the tolling of the steeple bells and the booming of cannon, moved slowly down Euclid Avenue to Erie, down Erie to Superior, thence down Superior to the Park, where had been erected a large building hung with drapery and silver fringe, beneath which rested the catafalque. Here, after appropriate ceremonies and impressive prayer, 65,000 silently filed past the coffin to look upon the fast-dissolving features of the honored dead. When all was over, the coffin was again conveyed to the train and departed for its western destination. The funeral was the most impressive and solemn ever conducted in Cleveland up to this time. Some idea of the commercial and industrial advancement made during the war may be gained by noticing a few of the principal industries and their standing in 1865. The population, as before stated, had increased 50%. The value of imports from lake traffic had increased 116% over that for 1857, and of the exports 190%. During this period were developed those great manufacturing industries which, in uniting the coal of Ohio and Pennsylvania with the iron of the Lake Superior country, and in refining the product of the petroleum fields, transformed Cleveland from a commercial to a manufacturing city. These industries were conducted with little or no profit before the war, but the extraordinary demands of the government called them into a prosperous existence. The receipts of coal in 1865 were 465,550 tons, twice as much as in 1860. The sales offices of all the Lake Superior iron ore companies were located at Cleveland, and their total product, which had increased from 114,401 tons in 1860 to 247,059 tons in 1864, was almost wholly received at Cleveland. The aggregate sales of manufactured and wrought iron in 1865 was $6 million. Petroleum refineries had reached the number of 30, most of them, however, conducted on a small scale, and none run on full time. In the lumber trade, Cleveland's receipts were greater than those of any other market on the lakes east of the lumber regions. The shipbuilding interests also were heavier than those of any other port. The vessels constructed were all wooden and were to be found on the Atlantic coast, in British waters, up the Mediterranean, and on the Baltic. Other industries incident to these leading ones shared their rapid progress, but on coal, iron, and oil it was evident the city's future depended. Her citizens had begun to turn their energies from railroads and commerce, for which plainly other cities at the head of the lakes offered broader scope of adjacent territory, to the developing of the resources of these three great natural products, and bringing them into the city's limits, there to undergo the final preparations for market. The war was opportune for such a change, and the energy of the previous decade in railroad building had furnished ready means for distributing all the coming manufactured products. During the succeeding years of peace, this progress, covering new fields, aided by great inventions, and stimulated by a more liberal policy, has gone forward by leaps. The unprecedented growth of private fortunes and the feeling of common dependence aroused by the war experiences have inspired in her citizens the republican virtue of public spirit, and the return of peace marks the inauguration of a long series of public charities, improvements, and adornments, of magnificent churches either built anew or remodeled upon older structures, of public libraries, hospitals, and reformatories, of colleges and schools, all projected and carried on by private citizens. Liberal invitations by owners of property have brought in foreign capitalists and manufacturers, a policy strangely neglected in anti-war days. For the first time, also, a metropolitan air began to fill the city. In architecture, the old flat, plain-windowed styles gave way to the modern artistic effects. Large ventures in business began to be familiar. Great corporations arose, seeking a continental patronage. Huge manufactories flung their banners of smoke to the breeze, while palatial residences and paved and decorated streets added attractiveness and grandeur. During the early months of 1865 occurred two destructive fires, which, like almost every casualty of that time, aroused suspicions of rebel emissaries. On January 1st, the Ives Brewery at the foot of Canal Street was destroyed, and on March 30th, the old Athenaeum building containing the largest audience room in the city on Superior Street next to the American buildings was burned. An affair of great interest at the time was the discovery of bribery in the office of the Provost Marshal for the 18th District of Ohio, Captain F.A. Nash, headquarters at Cleveland. A court-martial appointed by Commanding General Hooker met in Cleveland April 6, 1865, and found Captain Nash guilty of receiving bribes for procuring substitutes for drafted soldiers, and of making false certificates to the government dispersing officers, for which they condemned him to be cashiered from the army, to pay $2,000 fine, and to suffer imprisonment for 6 months. The latter two provisions of his penalty, however, were commuted by the commanding general. The return of the soldiers from the wars during the month of June was the signal for the final enthusiastic expressions of patriotism. The council appropriated $6,000 for the reception, and private donations were abundant. As all the soldiers from northern Ohio came first to Cleveland to be mustered out of the service, the entire month was required to feast and banquet them and to care for their wants. The soldiers' home, managed by the Ladies' Aid Society, was crowded with returning heroes, many of them disabled and in pressing need of attention. At successive periods came also Sheridan, Sherman, and Grant, each newly risen to fame and known only by their portraits and deeds. The reception to each of these generals was extremely hearty, and the curiosity to get a glimpse of them overrode all the barriers that usually hedge greatness about. General Grant was feted and lionized by the citizens, and to cap the height of enthusiasm, as he sat at the princely banquet at the Waddell House, a crown of flowers, like a royal wreath, was placed upon his head by one of Cleveland's admiring ladies. The 4th of July was celebrated this year with greater rejoicing than ever before. Recent history had furnished fresh reasons for its observance, a deeper and broader sense of its meaning, and of the truths for which it stands. The first monument to the fallen heroes of the war was dedicated at Woodland Cemetery to the dead of the 23rd Regiment of Ohio Volunteer Infantry, at which an address was given by General R.B. Hayes, former colonel of the regiment. In September occurred the memorable visit of Sir S. Morton Pato, the greatest of English railway contractors, and a large company of English and Spanish capitalists, while on a tour of inspection of the A&G.W. Railway in which their capital had been invested. The party was headed by James McHenry, the prime mover in the railroad enterprise, and Sir Morton Pato. There were also noted bankers, manufacturers, mine owners, engineers, brokers, and representatives of Spanish dukes and marquises, making in all the most remarkable mercantile body of men that has ever visited the city. Their coming aroused peculiar and sympathetic interest from the fact that they were the men who projected and constructed the great railroad during the period of war, when other citizens of England were prophesying and wishing the downfall of our republic, and when investments in America were considered as very precarious. Such a substantial proof of their confidence, together with the commercial prosperity which the new road promised for Cleveland, was sufficient to secure an enthusiastic reception. They were presented on 'change, 50 carriages conducted them on a tour of the city, and in the evening a great feast was provided at the Waddell House, where the American, English, and Spanish flags were suspended together, and happy speeches of mutual congratulation were made. The year 1865, among the varied events enclosed within its dates, marks also Cleveland's entry into the field of what has since become America's national game. Several contests of cricket occurred that summer, but with the solid growth of patriotism which distinguished the decade, this game was felt to be foreign and uncongenial, and was destined to be completely exiled by the new and patriotic substitute. A baseball club, the Forest Cities, had been organized the previous year, and as the fall of '65 approached, their increasing skill led them to challenge the Penfield Club of Oberlin College. This was the first match game ever played in Cleveland. The grounds were at the corner of Case Avenue and Kinsman Street, the game beginning at 1 o'clock in the afternoon before a large crowd of interested onlookers continued 4 hours and 15 minutes, till at the end of the 7th inning darkness kindly interposed. The balancing up showed that Oberlin had 68 runs to Cleveland's 28. The boys acknowledged themselves defeated, but all left the field with an appetite for the thrilling and healthy game. Several casualties were reported. One gentleman threw his arm out of place, another lost 2 eye teeth, and the face of another received a swift ball from the end of a bat. Though defeated this year, the Forest Cities gallantly retrieved their laurels the following spring by the unprecedented and never since repeated score of 127 tallies to 93. The elections of 1865 resulted in victories for the Union candidates. At the spring municipal election, H.M. Chapin was chosen mayor by a majority of 875 over David B. Sexton, the Democrat nominee. At the October election for governor, the Union majority for General Cox was 544. An interesting meeting of the National Equal Rights League was held at Garrett's Hall September 19th and 20th, attended by 150 colored delegates, principally from the South, at which the great movement for equality before the state and national laws was earnestly discussed and agitated. In the fall of 1865 was inaugurated St. Vincent's Charity Hospital, the first public hospital at the corner of Perry and Garden Streets. The building of a public hospital had been seriously discussed before the war, and several citizens had determined to start one. But the difficulties in the way of securing money at that time were so great that nothing was done until 1863, when Bishop Rappa was invited to undertake the project. He offered to furnish nurses from the Sisters of Charity, and entered with great energy upon the work of raising the money. Sectarian jealousies now sprung up, but through the personal help of Reverend Professor Peck of Oberlin, these were largely overcome. When 1/4 of the money was incurred, work was begun, and the building was completed at a cost of $75,000. Its architecture is of the so-called Franco-Italian style. It is built of brick 3 stories high and will accommodate 200 patients. The city council engaged to take a number of beds for the city poor, and the other wards are occupied by private patients. The Sisters of Charity have entire financial control and are the sole nurses. The surgical and medical work is under control of the medical department of the University of Worcester.